Morning, everyone, and welcome to what is, I think, the second of our lockdown press briefings. Thanks all for coming. I reiterate my hope that we can do this in person at some point in the not too distant future, though God knows when. We're here to discuss the new report that came out today that we've done called The Brexit Negotiations, a Stocktake. Before you all joined, Jill pointed out to me very kindly that there was a question mark on the title page. I have no idea what that's there for, but just to reassure you, it shouldn't be there. It's not meant to be a question. It is a stock take. I've got three colleagues who basically wrote most of this report here to talk you through it a little bit. And the format will be as it always is. They'll talk for about 5, 6, 7 minutes each, and then we'll go to Q&A. The way we've tended to do Q&As in the past is if you stick your hand up virtually, I will come to you and you will be able to ask your question. If you really want to write a question, I'll keep an eye on that, but we've so far tried to do it with people actually speaking their question, which makes it feel at least a little bit more interactive, I think. So without further ado, we'll kick off. Actually, let me quickly introduce the speakers. There's Jill Rutter of UK and a Changing Europe and the Institute for Government, Catherine Barnard from the University of Cambridge, and Jonathan Portes from King's College. You, I imagine, all know them already, so I won't go into any bios. But Jill, over to you to kick us off.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I'm going to tell you lots of things that you probably already know about where we are in the negotiations. Then Jonathan and Catherine will give you some detail that you might not know. So where are we? We've had 4 negotiating rounds. And one of the things that's been quite interesting the last couple of weeks is both sides have now set new deadlines. When he was talking in Parliament just about 10 days ago, David Frost said that he was targeting talks finishing by September, or the UK would sort of go off and prepare for no deal because businesses needed a degree of certainty. We can come on to business preparations later if you're interested. Michel Barnier last week at his press conference set a new deadline driven by the EU's need to ratify whatever deal emerges with the UK of the 31st of October. So this is Halloween 2, you might think, in the sort of film scripts. We had the Halloween deadline last year. We're now going to have another Halloween deadline because it's probably the EU deadline that matters more than the UK deadline for these talks. But anyway, that's where we are. We've had various reports on the tone of the talks. We know that after one round of meeting in person, they've had to move on Zoom. We know they were delayed when both Michel Barnier and David Frost appeared to go down with COVID. But we've now had 4 rounds, which have been variously described as cordial, combative. We had that spat exchange of letters, the sort of biggest letter writing thing since those Brown, Blair, Mandelson letters that we enjoyed so much back in the 1990s. So we had letter spat, and back on Friday, those who've been there before, we were pleased to see that we yet again had Michel Barnier adopting best schoolmaster pose and waving the political declaration at a naughty UK that he said was backtracking on all the commitments that he'd made back in October. And we've seen various briefings by people saying, well, actually, they were told by Dominic Cummings that they didn't need to pay much attention to all those agreements that Boris Johnson signed up to in October because we could get out of them once we'd withdrawn. Of course, the political declaration has a different status to the legally binding withdrawal agreement, now an international treaty. It was, after all, just intended rather as a sop to Theresa May in the first place, to give her something she could show, to show that she wasn't just through the withdrawal agreement signing a huge big check to the EU with absolutely no guarantees about the future relationship. So it's quite interesting that it's now morphed into this sort of millstone that Boris Johnson is trying to get away with. But anyway, we're approaching a critical deadline in that political declaration and in the withdrawal agreement. The fact that by the end of June, the 2 sides and the Joint Committee need to agree if they want to use provision for an extension. Catherine's going to talk much more about that, so I'm not going to say anything more about extension. But just to say where we are is we are currently falling over the entirely predictable set of stumbling blocks. First stumbling block, UK and Changing Europe report on the background to this out later in the week, so mark your diaries for that, is of course fish. What is very interesting here is that the 2 sides are locked into completely incompatible positions. Michel Barnier, under pressure from the fishing member states, is basically seeking to preserve the status quo, the CFP to be replicated in perpetuity. We know that the UK cannot, I think, accept that. All they are offering, and if you look at the UK's 4-page proposed draft agreement, all it offers is, we're an independent coastal state, we'll talk to you every year. Michel Barnier points out that's impossible, whereas the Norway fishing agreement covers 12 stocks. They say that the UK-EU one, because our waters are much bigger and interest much greater, will have to cover 100 fish stocks. You can't do that every year. We've seen some signs of movement on the negotiations both sides, but at the moment Michel Barnier is very much trapped by an inability to move. He seems to be appealing there for some space to negotiate. But the EU has said, without fish, no trade deal. The second stumbling block is the slightly arcane, and Catherine may be able to explain to you why this has changed such a significance on governance, the shape of the agreement. The UK wants lots of separate treaties. It wants to look like mini Switzerland. The EU hates the Swiss arrangement, does not want the UK to be Switzerland Mark II, so wants a single agreement. The good reasons for that, the EU says, is that will enable the partnership to evolve over time. As the two sides decide they want to add more things in, there'll be an overarching governance. You can slip in extended agreements there. We've seen Michel Barnier very frustrated, for instance, that this government doesn't want to cover foreign policy and defence cooperation in the agreement, though it does want to cover security cooperation in a separate treaty. But the bad reason, and the reason why the UK so doesn't want this, is that will enable the EU to do what's called cross-sectoral punishment. If the UK offends in one area, the EU can then take action in another area. The EU makes clear that, of course, that option is open to the UK, but this looms much larger for the EU than it does for the UK. The third set of stumbling blocks are over the famous level playing field. The ones on environment and social protection actually look potentially solvable. If you go back to some of the language in the political declaration, you go back to the fact that Michael Gove has already said that the UK there would be prepared to accept non-regression. Non-regression, after all, was what was in the Theresa May backstop as a condition of the UK-EU customs territory. But the big problem at the moment is the EU is stuck on the UK dynamically aligning on state aid. We know state aid is an area where the Johnson government has very, very different views from previous Conservative governments about the wonders potentially of state aid and wants to liberate itself from the EU regime. There are potential landing zones there on the substance of the UK state aid regime. We don't, after all, know what that's going to look like, but the UK will never accept dynamic alignment in the terms proposed by the EU. Question whether they can move. Michel Barnier seems to waver a bit on how stuck he is on EU law, and people picked him up on that. The final areas, although the UK has said, we just want what you've given everybody else, we'll have that, you gave that to Canada/Japan/South Korea, choose your EU agreement of choice, that's all we're asking for. That's not quite true. It's actually sensible that it's not quite true, because the UK is a very different economy to the EU, but we don't want to acknowledge that. We do have bigger asks on services. Michel Barnier refers to that as cherry picking. Others might say that that's just actually what you do in trade negotiation. Trade agreements are, after all, a bowl of cherries for each side. Just hope that they're sort of balanced cherries. That's where you end up with an agreement. And the UK actually in that also acknowledges that we are a bit closer to the EU than Canada by, for example, asking for a special deal on road haulage. Road haulage is not a great issue in the EU-Canada agreement or the EU-Japan agreement. It is actually a massive issue in the UK-EU agreement. You'll hear lots more from the Road Haulage Association and others about the number of truck permits. The UK's indicated that if the EU is too stroppy on level playing field, then actually, we'd accept some tariffs. Let's go to full Canada. Canada's only removed about 98% of tariffs, so 2% of tariffs in return for no level playing field. EU says no, that would take us loads longer to negotiate. We'd have to go back to member states and ask what they want on tariffs, and it doesn't give us enough comfort. That's not a substitute for the level playing field. So that's where we're stuck. What might push us over those stumbling blocks? Well, the big question is whether a Zoom meeting between Boris Johnson and Ursula von der Leyen, maybe even an in-person meeting, who knows, But Boris Johnson will then, of course, have to sort of go into 2 weeks quarantine if he goes over to Brussels in the next 3 weeks. A meeting with Ursula von der Leyen and Boris Johnson, could that be the new Wirral, the new sort of walk in the woods that got the deal over the line with the Irish after the Prime Minister bonded with Leo Varadkar? Wherever it's coming from, this is no longer a negotiation that can be solved at technical level. To push it over those stumbling blocks and reach a deal has to have come from the politicians to give the negotiators more space to negotiate. This may be number 2 or number 3 on the UK's to-do list. One of the things that COVID means is that the EU is very irritated that the UK is insisting on doing this while member states all have what they think are much, much more important things to deal with. So there's very little signs of real political engagement, not from the Commission, but from the member states on this. So will we do that? Depends on whether both sides want a deal. The EU really wanted a withdrawal agreement, less clear that it desperately wants a deal. It would like it because otherwise EU agriculture would be quite badly hit, and it does actually need a deal on fish. Does Boris Johnson want a deal? We don't know. And I'm going to leave it there and pass over to my colleagues.
Thank you very much, Jill. I should just say, actually, you've prompted me to remind people that we have a report on Brexit and fisheries that's due out this Friday and next week, and we'll probably do another briefing like this round that one. Quite a chunky piece of work on Brexit and its implications for manufacturing. But that ends the commercial break, so I'll just hand over to Catherine now.
Thank you very much indeed. So I'm going to talk about 2 things. One, I'm going to talk about the timeline, and secondly, to talk about transition and extending the transition. So in terms of thinking about timeline, Jill's already referred to some of this, but the June is clearly crucial, and it's crucial for the simple reason that if we're going to extend transition, as a lot of organisations have asked, because they're really worried about trying to negotiate a trade deal and crucially implement that trade deal by Christmas, we've got to ask by the end of June. The reality is EU have said, yes, absolutely, we can ask by the end of June, and they will be very happy to give an extension to transition, but the UK, of course, is adamant that we will not be doing that. So what's going to happen in the next month? There's going to be another meeting of the Joint Committee on the 12th of June. And of course, if we were going to ask for an extension to the transition, we would do it then. And then there should be a meeting between Boris Johnson and Ursula von der Leyen, as Jill has just said, possibly penciled in for the 15th of June. And then on the 19th of June is the last European Council. So in reality, if we hadn't asked for an extension by next week or the week after, that is it for asking for an extension under the terms of Article 132 of the withdrawal agreement. So end of June, we've got to ask for the extension, probably won't do so. Also, it's worth bearing in mind that the political declaration envisaged that there'd be an agreement on fisheries and an agreement on equivalents by the end of June. That looks like it's for the birds now. And so that means that assuming the UK doesn't walk away, as it suggested it might do if progress wasn't great, then we would be negotiating throughout the months of July, August, September. Remember, not a great deal happens in Brussels in August, but nevertheless, we're really pretty much up against it. Then EU say we've got to have some complete text by the end of October, the 31st of October. Why is that so important? It's important because it's very likely that any agreement that is concluded will be what's called a mixed agreement. And a mixed agreement means that it's got to be ratified by all of the national and regional parliaments. That's the 27 member states, plus the regional parliaments in places like Belgium. There's another 6 of them. All of that requires time. It also requires time to deliver on the UK's own implementation. We will have to have legislation to give effect to this agreement, and that will take time, although with the majority of 80, that will go through Parliament relatively easily. And then the idea is that the new deal comes into force on the 1st of January. What's missing from all of this narrative is how on earth is business going to have time to adapt, and how are the customs arrangements going to be put into place? What about the procurements? for new IT systems and so forth. So that's a timeline. The other issue I wanted to mention is let's assume the UK does start negotiating enthusiastically into the autumn. The EU gets on board, and it does look like things are going better than they are at the moment. But nevertheless, all the things I said need to be done before December just will not be done in time, in particular national ratifications. So is it possible to ask for an extension of time outside the Article 132 of the withdrawal agreement, which, as I said, is turned off at the end of June? Bottom line is probably it's going to be very difficult legally. There are a couple of ways that people have suggested you could do it. One possibility is to say, look at Article 50, we can just use Article 50 to amend the withdrawal agreement to give us a bit longer. Lots of EU lawyers say, no, that's not possible because Article 50 was turned off for the UK at the end of January. Another possibility is to do some sort of international agreement, but the trouble about doing an international agreement is it still will be extending EU law, and therefore by extending EU law, it needs to have a basis in the treaty. And there are two legal bases that are in sight, Article 207 and Article 217, but it's very likely to be a mixed agreement. So there you go, you need the member states to agree to all of that too. All of that will take time. So that brings us finally to the question, is it possible to have the agreement, but to front load it and say, actually, more or less EU law will carry on applying as is for a period of time with the phased turning off of EU law? And that seems the best way forward if you could get an agreement on that, to give us time, both on the UK side and the EU side, to actually operationalise the deal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Catherine. As I said, we'll have time for Q&A afterwards, but I propose for the moment we just press on and go straight over to Jonathan.
Thanks. I'm going to look at what the economic impacts, particularly if, as seems quite likely, transition is not extended, and in that case, if, as seems quite likely, there is either no deal or at most, a very limited deal. And in particular, the interaction between that sudden change in the UK's trading relationships as of January 1st, 2021, and the aftermath of or what we hope will be the aftermath of the pandemic. So there's been plenty of analysis of the medium to long-term impact of various Brexit scenarios. So our modelling suggested that moving to trading on WTO terms, i.e. what will happen by and large if there is no deal, would reduce UK GDP per capita by up to 8 or 9% over a period of 10 to 15 years compared to remaining in the EU. The government's own analysis reached pretty much the same conclusion. We also both looked at what would happen if the deal along the lines proposed by the government, a sort of thin trade deal with low or no tariffs on most things, but lots of other trade barriers, that would mitigate that, but actually not by that much. The long-term impacts would still be a fall of up to 6% of GDP. But those analyses look at the long-term impacts. They don't really shed any light on whether the impact would change much as we extended the transition, and perhaps most importantly, and the top of everyone's minds now, what would be the interaction between the sudden change to our trade arrangements at the end of 2020 and the COVID-19 crisis. And obviously, in current circumstances, that's the big deal. And I think, as Anand and I have written before, there are actually arguments in both directions here. You can, from a theoretical or economic perspective, I do genuinely think you can argue it both ways. There are a couple of reasons why actually not extending transition might be better given COVID. You can make a plausible argument that both, whether or not you think Brexit is a good thing in the long run, it's clearly a substantial structural shock to the UK economy. Adjustment will be required. We'll have to stop doing some things and start doing others. And the same is true of COVID. And if you're going to adjust, very simply, why not adjust once rather than twice? If adjustment costs overlap, it makes sense to get them all out of the way at once. The second reason why you might think we should do this all at once is that if COVID means that trade, travel, immigration, tourism are already depressed and perhaps still subject to some restrictions, then maybe it's easier to deal with the frictions and the adjustment costs of moving to trade barriers with the EU at a time when those things are already depressed. What are the arguments the other way? Well, one argument is that when you're recovering from a very, very severe economic shock, that's precisely the wrong time at which to make major changes to our large trading relationship. Businesses are going to be trying to rebuild, reestablish themselves in international markets, rebuilding supply chains. If you combine that with the sudden imposition to new trade barriers, then the UK might find it excluded from those supply chains and markets as they rebuild. The second argument against is that the nature of the adjustments required to COVID might interact with the imposition of trade and regulatory barriers with the EU so as to magnify both, especially if global supply chains, in particular trade with China and so on, becomes less attractive or sustainable. And obviously there's plenty of evidence of that. And then I think the third, it's the argument you hear a lot from the business community and the press, is the overload argument that neither business nor perhaps government have the spare capacity, that's financial capacity, management time, staff resources, to absorb a further major shock. I think our view is that on balance, COVID-19 probably does make the economic risks of exiting transition in January 2021 without a trade deal even larger than they already are. But this is not a clear, there are a lot of uncertainties here, and I certainly wouldn't want to put a number on it. But I think in terms of the balance of risk, that is the way the argument goes. Finally, just a word about immigration. And again, here, the issue is not about whether or not we do a deal, because actually the UK is going to have a completely new immigration system after the end of transition either way, because immigration isn't really a topic of discussion in the negotiation. So from that point, neither side really wants to talk about immigration. So from that point of view, it doesn't really matter whether or not we have a deal. We're going to need radical changes to the immigration system after the end of transition, because free movement, which carries on during transition, will come to an end. And so in that sense, that means that if transition isn't extended, we need a new immigration system in January 2021, deal or no deal. And here again, I think the risks are pretty high. I've been broadly positive about the impact of the new immigration system in principle. Given where we could have been under Theresa May, it's actually remarkably positive, and changes post-COVID may make it even more so. But introducing a far-reaching reform to immigration in less than a year would have been challenging under normal circumstances, given everything else that's going on and the way, the well-known structural problems with the Home Office. Doing it in the aftermath of COVID-19 seems, an almost unprecedented challenge. And I think there are really big risks here, not just short-term disruption, but the reputational risk to the UK. For the rest of the world, and both the EU and the rest of the world, change to the immigration system here will be one of the single largest and most visible immediate change resulting from Brexit. There's an opportunity here, as many proponents of Brexit have long argued. It will enable the UK to present itself as global Britain, an open, outward-oriented migration system, encouraging skilled migration from the whole world. But if the introduction of the new system is perceived to be bungled and chaotic, it could have precisely the opposite impact, and that could have really damaging long-term negative impacts. And I think that's a real risk the government should be mindful of. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Just to remind you to do, a couple of you have raised your hands, and I'll come to you, John, in a sec. But just, Jonathan, first, there are a couple of things related to immigration that the British have asked for, aren't there, which is visa-free travel for short-term business trips and something on mutual recognition of qualifications. In the event, and I'm not sure they will, but in the event the EU were to say yes to that, does that have big implications for us and for our system?
Well, I think one imagines that visa-free travel or travel with an electronic pre-clearance, the way we currently do it to the US, is going to be the destination, deal or no deal. You don't really need a trade deal to do that. It makes sense for both sides. So one way or another, one sort of assumes that's going to happen. Business travel is more complicated, and there will certainly be, I think, under any circumstances, there are going to be significant frictions which don't exist at the moment, and you could partly reduce those frictions through a deal. But none of those issues, those aren't really about immigration or moving for work purposes. Those are very much about the short term. The fact is that we're going to move to a new system for people coming from the EU after transition ends, whenever that is, regardless of what's in the deal.
Brill, thank you. John, I think you're now allowed to talk, but you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Absolutely.
Gosh. Okay. I wanted to ask Catherine about the extension deadline. I'm sure you will have seen the IFG paper recently, which said, I quote, "We find that 30 June is not the final opportunity to secure more time." I'm not sure. I think your analysis is a bit tougher than that. That if you don't do the 30th of June, securing more time will be extremely difficult to do. And the reason why I'm interested in this is that people around number 10 seem to not treat the 30th of June as a real deadline. They think that they can just fix it in October somehow. Do you think that they're being a bit optimistic?
Yeah, yes, I do. Legally, the official answer is end of June is what the withdrawal agreement provides in Article 132. And there is no way of amending that within the text of the withdrawal agreement. So the joint committee, which is the committee meeting between the EU and the UK, actually has powers to amend aspects of the agreement, but it can't amend Article 132 nor 126. 126 is the provision which says transition ends at the end of December 2020. So the question then is, how do you get around this problem that Article 132 is turned off? You can't use the joint committee. International lawyers say, oh, well, you can use Article 50 to try and amend the withdrawal agreement. EU lawyers would say, actually, that's not possible because Article 50 is turned off. It was turned off on the 31st of January when we left. Some people say, well, we could have some sort of international deal which extends the transition period. But the trouble is, because you're extending the application of EU law, on the EU side, they need to have a legal provision which allows them to do that. And so all of this points to the fact it's really very difficult to extend transition beyond June. That said, if there is a serious political will to do so, it may be that some magnificent fudge could be dreamed up by the brilliant lawyers in the EU with the assistance of the brilliant lawyers on the UK side. But it is not obvious what's the route to get there. So that's why it'd be more interesting to see whether you could front end the deal. And I think that's one of the things that the IFG also talks about. So say, well, we have a period of transition into the deal. Now, there's no sign of that in any of the texts that either the UK or the EU have put out. But could you have an agreement that also phases out the current application of EU law? And that would be unusual, but if you think about any international agreement, it has a transition phase into it. And so what we're doing the reverse, we're having a transition phase out.
Thanks.
Thank you. Just incidentally, for those who haven't seen it, Tim Bale's got an interesting piece in the New Statesman this morning about why it is that Keir Starmer hasn't said anything at all about transition and why it might be in his best interest to continue to not say anything at all about extending transition. And that's one of the factors around this debate is the opposition have said absolutely nothing, or certainly the leader of the opposition has said absolutely nothing about this, which alters the political debate a little bit. Lisa, if your new laptop will allow you to talk, do you want to have a go? You're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, this is spectacularly successful.
This is great. This is my third laptop and Zoom actually works on it. Good morning, everybody. I have a question for Jonathan. Everybody's been really interesting and it's great to get a catch up and reminder of all the issues that we knew so well before COVID. Jonathan, I'm just wondering on the issue of transition about the cost. You said you didn't want to put a figure on it. Not so much COVID, but the question of extending. And you spoke very clearly about the arguments the other way, the severe economic shock, etc. Have you any idea of what extra cost to business in terms of figure and also to the supply chain would be, or the benefits would be, if we did extend rather than not extend?
I think, frankly, my view is that from a modelling perspective, that's almost impossible because the costs, extending in itself doesn't change the costs of adjustment. It merely pushes them off another year. So I'm reasonably confident that the cost of exiting without a deal a year ago would have been higher than the costs of exiting without a deal after transition in December 2020 because businesses have had more time to adjust, and some of the costs that would have happened if we'd exited without any deal, including withdrawal agreement, have gone, since at least there is a legal framework in place. But I think it's reasonable to say that giving businesses another year or 2 years till December 2021 or 2022 would further reduce those costs. They would reduce the likelihood of disruption. You'd have more time to plan, to adjust, to hire customs agents, and all the other things that will smooth that process of readjusting to new trading arrangements. But I think for economists to try and quantify that, how much extra it would save, I'm afraid it is in my view a fool's game. So I'm not going to try and do it. I do think that that the benefits of the economic benefits of not having no deal last year and at least getting to December 2020 are quite substantial. The further benefits of extending beyond that are non-zero, but significantly less.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. I should also just draw your attention. There was a very interesting piece done by Thomas Sampson of the LSE on our website a week or two ago, in which they tried to look at what has happened to UK-EU trade since the Brexit vote. And the conclusion was actually very little. That trade has been maintained much as before. So one of the questions that piece raises is that because we've totally exaggerated the impact, or is that because all of the impact is yet to come and it's going to come quite suddenly, quite close to when transition is about to end? But Jill, do you want to say anything about preparedness? Business preparedness in particular.
Just to come in on preparedness, I think one of the issues, Lisa, between if you assume we're going to get a similar sort of deal or no deal in late December or some further date in the future, the big difference really is on whether businesses have sort of trained up the customs agents, got the systems in place to manage that, because the short run problems are from a switch of systems, and that's made worse if people aren't ready for the switch in systems. The big plus, if you like, of the aim that the deal that Boris Johnson envisages for business over the deal which Theresa May envisaged is that you actually have to make many of the same preparations. We don't know whether they'll be able to negotiate some of the easements on veterinary agreements or on customs facilitation, but the bones of the deal are quite similar in the sense that Theresa May's deal long run probably wouldn't have had customs formalities in it because she was aiming at something that removed the need for a hard border in the island of Ireland and may very well have stuck with in some sort of thing that would have been dressed up as a customs union, whereas businesses now know that they are going for a deal which does involve a proper border between the UK or between GB and the continent, but also between GB and Northern Ireland. So the further apart the two are on trade, the bigger that border is in the Irish Sea. But as Michael Gove said, I think the other week to one of the select committees when he was giving evidence, Canada and Australia obviously government code for no deal. Canada and Australia are similar but not identical. That's because of tariffs, etc. But they're not nearly as far apart as no deal as Australia would have been with Theresa May's Chequers common rule book, potential customs area and stuff like that. So businesses now have better knowledge of what to prepare for. They're not going to be wasting costs preparing for customs formalities at the border. The real issue that you're seeing from business groups increasingly is that because they're having to focus on managing around COVID, they actually just are not sort of sending people off on customs agents courses and stuff like that, and getting all of that ready because they are so stretched by managing the current crisis.
And of course, there are specific problems in sectors like pharmaceuticals where COVID is creating problems in terms of trying to stockpile now and creating difficulties down the line if you've got to stockpile again. Next, we've got Adam Parsons. Can I just ask speakers to introduce themselves to everyone in case other people don't know who they are when they ask their question? But Adam, I am now allowing you to talk. I love this power.
Very good, thank you. Adam Parsons from Sky News. I wanted to ask the panel if I could just a sort of quick question each, which is to do with the effect of COVID, and also bearing in mind that last year we had all these deadlines that were said to be sacrosanct and then disappeared. So I wonder, Catherine, from your perspective, do you think that is affecting decision making now? And there's a great rump of people in Westminster and Brussels who think deadlines, schmedlines, that they'll come and go. Jonathan, I wondered on the economic side, from a political perspective, do you think that COVID actually gives cover for a no deal, in that every economy is going to be shredded to some extent, and that the economic impact of a no deal may be covered by the COVID impact? And Jill, I wonder, a quick thought, if I could, from you about state aid. I see the French have just put a €15 billion package to support their aerospace industry. Do you think this is a grayer area now, that actually the UK government can go back and say, the EU, you seem to have lost control over what state aid means, so we need a more fundamental discussion of what state aid is going forward? Sorry, I know that's quite a lot there.
Shall I kick off?
Yes, please.
Thank you, Adam. I hear what you say, deadlines, smedlines, and of course I also hear what you say that there were a lot of changes to deadlines last year, and lots of and 3 extensions. But the key issue this time round is it's a really hard deadline laid down by a treaty. Previously, there was much more. There was flexibility. But I also accept that. Brexit's not the priority on the EU side. I'm talking to a German colleague who says it's about number 10 in the list of German priorities. So the EU side, apart from Michel Barnier and his team, are not fixated on all of this. And also it's very likely that the European Council on the 19th of June will not be devoting much, if any, time at all to discussing Brexit. Of course, we're Brexit nerds, so we're spending time thinking about it. The other thing I just want to say is that what the UK has never really got its head round is that the EU is a system which is entirely set up by law. Now, Anand and I are forever arguing about this because I always say law trumps politics, and he incorrectly says politics trumps law. But the bottom line is that the EU has got to act where it's got the powers to do so. And the problem is there is no obvious place to go to get the power to extend the transition period. And so that's where the problem lies. And that's why ingenious solutions relying on international law have been talked about. But the bottom line is it's got to be done by law. The other thing I would say is that it's done by law, and the question is, what happens if we get it wrong? Who's going to challenge it? and how's it going to be challenged? What's the time frame for that challenge?
Just can I follow up very, very briefly? I would say if the European Council unanimously in November said, we see an interest in maintaining the status quo, you can call it transition, you can call it something else, but actually we can see a deal in the making here. We just need 6 more months, make it so. They'll make it so, won't they?
So, as I say, as I said at the beginning, never underestimate the ingenuity of lawyers. And also the question is, who is going to kick up rough? You can go to the European Court of Justice and say to them, look, where's the legal provisions to do this? This is an ultra vires treaty. But all of that will probably take about 6 months. So, and by that time we will have delivered. These are difficult legal matters. But I absolutely get it. Maybe ultimately you're right that politics trumps because the wheels of law move slowly.
Brilliant, thank you. Jonathan, do you want to go next?
Yes, so I think my view is, we don't know where we will go with the economic impacts of COVID, but assuming that we are firmly on in the exit recovery stage by September, October, I don't actually think that COVID will provide much of a smokescreen, as it were, for the economic impacts of what happens in January 2021. I think that to the extent that there are immediate issues with disruption, with problems in supply chains, with relocations of business activity, it will be reasonably clear that those are attributable to the new trade barriers that result from Brexit, and people will perceive those. And similarly, if there are issues relating to the introduction of a new immigration system, again, it will be pretty obvious that those are driven by that rather than by COVID. Of course, interpreting statistics may be more difficult, but I don't think that is actually the main issue. That, to the extent, and as I say, I think it's difficult to say how big this will be, but to the extent that there are significant short-term negative impacts from leaving with no deal in January 2020, no trade deal in January 2021, I think that will be reasonably clear and apparent to business and to the general public. So I don't think that this idea, well, we can just shove the economic consequences of no trade deal under the COVID carpet, I don't see that really as working.
Thank you. Jill?
I just wanted to add to that I think if you think about what COVID's done, it's basically shut down non-tradable services. That's what we can't buy at the moment. That's the bit where, apart from labour effects, Brexit doesn't actually have that much effect, because that's stuff we produce and consume at home. The bit that has held up is the stuff that's most vulnerable to a disruptive Brexit, which is food supply chains. So anyway, and I think those months are also the time in which we're most dependent on imports for our food. So that's just a bit of gloom there. On state aid, I think it's a very interesting point. I think it's probably, I'm not a super expert on this, you probably are more with me, Adam. I think there's probably a row going to be had within the EU about the future of state aid, as you see some big deep pockets countries like France and Germany trying to keep their businesses alive, and some of the poorer member states saying that that's very unfair. So there may be an argument going on there. I think the interesting thing about the UK is you would say that the landing zone on state aid is to move away from the principle and to get onto the substance of, well, what does the UK's future state aid regime look like, and what guarantees can the UK give? The UK, after all, compared to many other EU member states, is a relatively low state aid regime at the moment. All those sort of comparisons about how much, what percentage of GDP goes in state aid, there's fairly ropey numbers, but suggest the UK is down on the lower state aid. Yeah, wrong. But I think because of the emphasis on the UK side of the principle of regulatory autonomy, we're not in your regulatory orbit. Does the UK know That's the first question. Has it actually worked out what its future regime for supporting business, future government procurement regime and stuff like that's going to look like? I'm not sure that they have. And second, even if they had, are they prepared to share that? Do they regard that as a legitimate area for discussion with the EU? Down the line, the EU may be forced, if it wants a deal, to have much weaker level playing field provisions on state aid and resort to what is traditional if you think one country is unfairly subsidising its business, which is trade defence. But when Stefan de Rink spoke at, Michel Barnier's spokesman spoke at the Institute for Government last week, we asked him specifically, why don't you just rely on trade defence? Isn't that your big sort of state aid get out clause? He said, well, we basically want to have the arguments up front and build in prevention through the state aid provisions in the trade agreement, rather than have continual disputes with the UK. So this is sort of the EU trying to sort of batten down the hatches before the UK sort of rabbit hops out of the cage. I think that's a very mixed metaphor.
Can I just add?
Yep, go ahead.
On state aid, of course, one of the issues about state aid is, as it's currently drafted in the EU version of the text, is that cases should end up before the Court of Justice. And of course, that is a real red line for the UK. Already the language has softened a bit. The cases may, if they involve points of EU law, end up before the Court of Justice. The other thing I would say about state aid is, even if you don't have state aid provisions in the agreement, EU competition law, which includes state aid, has extraterritorial effect. In other words, that if the effect of any agreement has an effect on the EU, then EU competition law will apply. And so this is the thing that they are, this is another possible fallback.
Yeah.
Jill, you're waving.
Sorry, can I just, the other bit that, Catherine may have a view on that, the other bit that is sort of up for discussion is how much the commitment in the Northern Ireland Protocol already not to observe EU state aid rules in anything that affects trade between Northern Ireland and the single market, how much that will affect and have application in GB. And some people think that's quite an extensive provision. Others, the UK government stresses that they think this has minimal effects on what we do within Great Britain, at least. And one of the things always to remember in all of this is different rules will apply in Northern Ireland. We haven't spoken about that, but Northern Ireland will certainly on goods be in a very separate and different regime.
It might be worth pointing. I mean, the one thing that's specific to the UK, well, not specific, but where the UK might have a problem that others don't, is this criterion in the state aid rules about undertakings in difficulty. And because we have quite a lot, particularly in the tech sector, of venture capital funded firms that operate at a loss, because that's the business model, they tend to fall foul of EU state aid rules. And that is something that happens more often here, I think, than in many, many other member states. And so there are elements of the rules that are a particular problem for us, more so than other member states. But Adam, I'm going to assume that your questions, did you want to say something, Catherine?
No, it's fine, go ahead.
Okay, that your questions have been answered. Stick your hand, I'll take your hand down, stick it up again if not. And Uta, over to you.
Morning, can you hear me?
We can, this is brilliant.
Morning, hello. Ute Kobold from ZDF German Television. I try to focus at the end of the month, given that Johnson promised nothing more than getting Brexit done by the end of this year, and looking at the legal framework Catherine has outlined with the deadlines. Whom do you see more under the pressure, Johnson or von der Leyen, in the coming meeting? And what do you expect in practical terms, what the outcome might be? So maybe that's for Anand.
Oh God, I was so busy putting people's hands up and down, you're going to have to ask me again.
Johnson and von der Leyen meeting. Who do you think is more under pressure in that meeting, given the deadlines the EU has to stick to? And what do you expect as a practical outcome?
I think at the moment, no one's under particular pressure. I mean, I think things will start to. I mean, this is the weird thing about having the transition deadline so far ahead of the actual deadline, is I think people aren't really focused on that outcome in December as yet. So they'll both feel quite relaxed. I think on both sides, there is a sense that we would prefer a deal, but we can live with no deal. If, you know, I mean, we could be in a different world in the autumn. I think the talks could get unlocked in the autumn, as Jill said earlier. It will require politics. It will require linkage. It will require, you know, someone at the top to say, actually, we're going to be more flexible on fish, for instance. But if we're in the middle of a massive second wave come the autumn, then actually the chances of the two sides sitting down and giving this the time it requires are very, very limited. But I think at the moment, this will be my sense is that this will be quite a low-key meeting. They'll meet, they'll say, look, let's keep talking. We both have an interest in getting a deal, and then they'll go away and try again. I'm not convinced that even in June, this is the moment when politics unlocks this process, because I don't think anyone is particularly feeling the pinch yet. I don't know if anyone else wants to come in on that.
I mean, I agree with the politics and the political analysis, but the reality is, if you just look at the texts, each side published their texts. The EU one sort of 500 pages, the UK one 400, plus all of these separate agreements. And actually, if there's going to be serious negotiation on each one, and it's a vast undertaking, it's highly technical, and it will require a huge amount of effort. But there are, as Jill helpfully outlined right at the beginning, there is half a dozen things which are real stumbling blocks. And then there's the technical negotiations that need to go on underneath to try and sort out all sorts of detail about, for example, in the field of services, whether business travellers and ICT people will have how many months they can stay, what's the gaps in between. All of that will just take time to sort out. But it is a massive undertaking. And the other thing that, of course, we've not mentioned at all, and I thought was interesting in the Barnier press conference, is the role of the European Convention on Human Rights. And this is also likely to become quite a big issue, essentially for the law enforcement chapter, which, of course, we are very keen on, because indeed the UK led the way on a lot of the law enforcement arrangements in the EU. EU have said we've got to stay committed to the European Convention on Human Rights. Indeed, it's expressly stated in the political declaration that we will stay signed up to the principles of the European Convention on Human Rights. And yet now this is increasingly becoming a red line, because the UK says it's a sovereign state and doesn't want to be told what to do by the EU. And the data sharing, the extradition provisions, really important for the UK. So while politicians might say, oh, well, we're relaxed about a no trade deal Brexit, in fact, an awful lot of other people who actually have to run things, like the police, are not relaxed about a no trade deal Brexit. They do want to be able to have access to these data sharing arrangements. And the trouble is, if we leave with no deal and it's very messy in January and there are food shortages, the acrimony on both sides will be acute. And it will take a long time to get round the table again to try and sort out the things we should have been sorting out now.
Jill?
If just to sort of come in on the politics again, Rutter, I mean, I think it is striking how, compared to last year when Parliament was absolutely dominated by Brexit, there have been so few sort of occasions, partly there's sort of virtual Parliament, but also because Parliament's doing lots of other things. One of the reasons, of course, that the government wanted to bring Parliament back in physical form was to be able to make progress with the outstanding Brexit legislation. And I think they were very nervous about doing public bill committees in a virtual form, not least because they find it quite difficult to control amendments. They're already facing pressure on things like animal welfare standards. But one of the things that's interesting, that while Keir Starmer hasn't called for an extension, the government basically is going up against all three other nations of the UK if it proceeds as is. Scottish government's asked them to extend, the Welsh government's asked them to extend, and last week the Northern Ireland Assembly passed a motion, DUP voting against, but saying you should extend. So it's quite a high risk gamble, and particularly in terms of potentially moving to Scottish elections next year and a possible Indie ref down the line. So there is a political price potentially to be paid for getting this wrong. Meanwhile, sort of Keir Starmer, as Tim Bale said today, is lurking in the background saying, well, you said you'd get a deal by the end of the year, so show us your deal. So I think it's quite interesting how that comes in. So maybe the politics are a bit underplayed at the moment, and we'll come back, you know, if we get a sort of COVID respite. We're seeing a bit of that now with COVID going slightly down the news agenda. So that could be back in the autumn and increase the political pressure on the government.
I do wonder whether when we get to the autumn, how many people are going to be saying, well, you should have had an extension. I mean, I'm not convinced that this debate comes back to haunt them. Obviously, if they don't get a trade deal, then Starmer's got a line of attack. But anyway, Uta, I hope that answered your question. And Masato.
Thank you very much. Long time no see. I'm happy to see you. And my question is Japan issue. BBC reported UK and Japan are set to begin talks today aimed at reaching agreement on a post-Brexit trade deal. What is the implication, or why this timing? And also, it is related to TPP join of United Kingdom.
Yep.
Do we say that?
If you like to.
The timing is because Japan is one of the countries that's refusing to roll over the UK's existing trade deal that it's accessed as an EU member. Japan has said, as I understand it, that it won't roll that over, which is why we need to initiate talks with Japan. And in a sense, that makes the Japan deal, though obviously it's sort of only just coming in, makes the Japan deal in many ways more urgent than trade deals with countries with whom we haven't got a trade deal through the EU, like the US. So I don't think it's at all surprising that the UK is trying to do a deal with Japan. The interesting question, I think, is how different is the deal that Japan will offer the UK to the one that the UK accessed as an EU member? Anand, you've gone me. Anand?
Sorry, is anyone else hearing noises in the background? Oh, maybe that's in my head. Does anyone else want to come in on this? I mean, the one thing I'd say is Liz Truss this morning has talked about the great trade opportunity here. What I would say is, the EU already has a pretty good trade deal with Japan that we are part of now. And the idea that this new negotiation will open up more trade strikes me as slightly fanciful. I think what we're talking about here is preserving what we've already got rather than making any new gains. Don't know if either Catherine or Jonathan want to come in. Catherine? No, Jonathan?
Yeah, no. I agree with that. I mean, mostly we're just talking about trying to preserve the current arrangements rather than extending them, and even that looks likely to be quite problematic.
Yeah, and it's always worth reminding ourselves of those, those original government forecasts that were, I think it was the Huffington Post that leaked the photocopies of them, and that figure of the sort of gains from other trade deals versus losses from tariff or non-tariff barriers in terms of trade with the European Union. I don't think there's any serious economic study that claims that these kind of trade deals with countries that are so far away are going to make up for the lost trade with the European Union in the short to medium term, at least. If none of the panelists have got anything final to say on this, we've reached actually the end of our slot. It's now 9:30. Do any of you want to come in? Okay, well, in which case, let me thank the three of you. Let me thank everyone who's attended. It is frustrating not to be able to see each other, as Masato says. I hope you're all missing the Crap King's coffee as much as I am. But we will, I think, we are doing one of these next week around our manufacturing report. So it'd be great if you could join us then. And in the interim, as ever, if there's anything you want to ask, just get in touch. And in the meanwhile, keep well, everyone. Thank you for coming, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you all.